I am Julian Hayes, 32 years old. 2 years ago, I stood in the freezing marble-paved driveway of a 5-star mountain resort while my own brother humiliated me in front of our father, publicly mocking my bank account, my career, and my entire existence. While I was just trying to show up, extending an olive branch and trying to be a part of this family, my parents just stood there. They actually smiled as my brother laughed at me in front of dozens of wealthy guests and resort staff. But there was one massive, undeniable thing they didn't know. I wasn't just some struggling, desperate guy trying to keep up appearances to earn their love. I was the man whose proprietary technology was currently running the infrastructure of that entire luxury estate, and I had the legal documents sitting securely in my leather briefcase, completely ready to strip my brother of his fake corporate empire and trigger a massive corporate lawsuit. And now, 2 years later, they are the ones leaving desperate voicemails, begging for my forgiveness, and realizing their golden child is nothing but a fraud. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect illusion brick by brick, hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Now, let's go back to the moment the tables finally permanently turned. You know what the worst part about toxic family members is? They know exactly where to insert the knife because they are the ones who studied your anatomy. They know your insecurities because they installed them. The air up in the mountains that Friday afternoon was crisp and incredibly sharp, the kind of cold that immediately bites at your cheeks the second you step out of the vehicle. I pulled my fully restored vintage Porsche 911 up to the grand, sweeping entrance of the Silver Pines Resort. The architecture of the place was breathtaking. It was a sprawling masterpiece of heavy, dark timber and massive, floor-to-ceiling glass panels that reflected the stunning snow-capped peaks surrounding the valley. It was the exact kind of high-end real estate my family loved to be seen in. The kind of place that screamed generational wealth, exclusive memberships, and hidden bank accounts. My father, Arthur Hayes, had rented out a massive, exclusive wing of the resort for what he pretentiously called the Hayes Family Legacy Retreat. He was the founder and CEO of Hayes Consulting, a man who treated his children not as human beings, but as corporate assets. In his mind, you were either a blue-chip stock paying high dividends to the family name, or you were a bad investment that needed to be liquidated. For my entire life, I was treated like the bad investment. I put the car in park, killed the engine, and handed my keys to the young valet who hurried over. That is exactly when I heard it. The slow, sarcastic, echoing clapping coming from the top of the stairs. I turned around to see my older brother, Tristan, walking down the sweeping stone steps. He was 34 years old, wearing a tailored, navy cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than the salary of the valet parking my car. Next to him was our father, looking as sharp, rigid, and severe as ever. Clinging to Tristan's arm was his wife, Vanessa. Vanessa had that perfect, heavily contoured, polished smile she always wore when she was about to say something absolutely terrible disguised as a compliment. Tristan stopped a few feet away from me. He looked at my beautiful Porsche, then looked at my simple, unbranded wool coat, and let out a loud, theatrical, mocking laugh. Well, Tristan sneered, his voice loud enough for the arriving guests to hear. I didn't know they let rental cars onto the property, Julian. Did you have to drain your entire checking account and max out your credit cards just to look presentable for the weekend? You know there's no shame in taking the bus. My father did not step in. My father did not correct him. My father just adjusted his expensive watch, let out a heavy sigh, and gave me a look of pure, unadulterated disappointment. He shook his head slowly. Julian, why do you always have to be so flashy with things you clearly cannot afford? This weekend is about serious business and family legacy, not your little pretending games. Tristan took a step closer, invading my personal space, the smell of his expensive cologne practically suffocating. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. You can't possibly afford this lifestyle, little brother. Playing pretend and trying to act like you belong in our tax bracket is just embarrassing the family name. We all know you're scraping by. I looked right into Tristan's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I did not get angry. I just stood there, letting the cold wind whip around us, staring at a man who was entirely built of hollow arrogance. Before I could say a single word in my defense, the heavy, intricately carved oak doors of the main lobby swung open. Mr. Vance, the general manager of the resort, stepped out quickly. He was a distinguished, silver-haired man who usually only dealt with billionaires, hedge fund managers, and heads of state. He walked straight past my father. He walked straight past Tristan and Vanessa. He stopped right in front of me, squared his shoulders, and offered a deep, incredibly respectful bow. "Welcome back, Mr. Hayes," Mr. Vance said, his voice carrying the utmost reverence. "It is an absolute honor to have you with us again. Your private VVIP suite is ready, and we have configured the climate, lighting, and security exactly to your personal system preferences. Shall I have your usual vintage Bordeaux sent up?" The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. It was deafening. You could have heard a single snowflake hit the pavement. Tristan's smug, arrogant smile vanished instantly. His jaw actually dropped, his mouth hanging open like a fish out of water. Vanessa blinked rapidly, her eyes darting frantically between my worn boots and the impeccably dressed manager. But the absolute best reaction was my father's. Arthur Hayes, a man who prided himself on knowing everything about everyone, a man who controlled every narrative, looked completely derailed. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. I gave Mr. Vance a polite, warm nod. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. I appreciate the attention to detail. Please send the wine up. I'll be heading to my suite shortly." I turned back to my family. I grabbed my worn leather overnight bag from the valet, looked right into my father's shocked eyes, and walked past them without saying a single word. When I swiped the sleek black keycard and stepped into my massive, multi-room penthouse suite overlooking the sweeping Pine Valley, I didn't feel the need to celebrate. I didn't pour a drink and toast my victory. I just felt a cold, incredibly sharp focus. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk, set my bag down, and unzipped the front pocket. I pulled out a thick, heavy legal manila folder. Inside that folder was a massive corporate lawsuit waiting to happen, a stack of international patents, and the absolute, undeniable destruction of Tristan's entire career. I poured myself a glass of ice water, looked out at the majestic mountains, and thought about the excruciating decade of hell they put me through to get me to this exact room. 10 years ago, I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, carrying a mountain of student debt, and sitting nervously in my father's cavernous, intimidating home office. The room smelled heavily of expensive imported cigars, old leather bindings, and ego. I was sweating through my cheap, poorly tailored graduation suit. I had spent my entire senior year pulling all-nighters and skipping every social event, building a prototype for a revolutionary smart home integration system. It was raw, it was unpolished, but the core coding was absolutely solid. I just needed a small seed loan to get it off the ground. A tiny fraction of the money my father had happily handed over to Tristan for a failed, pretentious restaurant venture 2 years prior. A venture that went bankrupt and had lawyers fighting over unpaid vendor bills for months. I laid the detailed schematics out on his massive mahogany desk. I eagerly explained the vision. I told him how automated, AI-driven infrastructure was the undeniable future of commercial real estate development. Arthur barely even looked at the papers. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and sighed. It was that heavy, exhausted, deeply patronizing sigh he reserved exclusively for me. "Julian," he started, his tone dripping with condescension, "you lack vision. You're a tinkerer." Hayes Consulting was built on solid, traditional business relationships, face-to-face negotiations, and real estate acquisition, not flashy, unstable tech gimmicks that will be obsolete in a year. You are wasting your degree, and frankly, you are embarrassing my work ethic with these little garage projects. Then came the ultimatum, the trap. He leaned forward, his eyes cold. "If you want to be a part of this family's legacy, you need to earn your keep. Tristan has just been handed a massive promotion to Vice President of Acquisitions. I want you to start at the bottom of his division. You'll be his data entry clerk. You will manage his spreadsheets, organize his files, and learn how a real business operates under his guidance. He wanted me to be a glorified secretary for the brother who used to pay other kids to do his high school homework because he was too busy partying. He wanted to subjugate me, to keep me firmly beneath Tristan's heel so the family hierarchy remained perfectly intact. I looked at the blueprints I had poured my soul into. I gathered them up, placed them back in my cheap folder, and politely declined. I told him I believed in my product, and I believed in myself. The backlash was swift and ruthless. That very weekend, my mother, Eleanor, invited me to her exclusive country club for brunch. I was naive enough to think she was going to support me, maybe slip me a check or offer some maternal encouragement. I was a fool. Over a plate of overpriced eggs Benedict, she reached across the pristine white tablecloth and patted my hand. She used her soft, melodic, upper-crust society voice to deliver the most venomous, soul-crushing words I had ever heard. "Julian, darling," she cooed, her eyes devoid of any warmth. "You need to stop this pathetic competition with Tristan. It's embarrassing for all of us. Tristan is the face of the family. He has the charisma, the looks, the pedigree. He is meant to lead. Your presence, well, your little rebellions are just a distraction. You need to learn to accept your place in the background. We spent so much on your college fund, sacrificing our own comfort, and this is how you repay us? By refusing to support your own blood." She spoke about sacrificing their comfort as if they were scraping by on a minimum wage salary, desperately trying to keep the lights on instead of pulling in millions of dollars a year, maxing out their 401ks, and debating which European country to buy a summer home in. I realized right then, sitting under the crystal chandeliers of that dining room, that my family did not want a second son. They wanted a backup generator. And when I absolutely refused to be plugged into Tristan's machine to power his ego, they permanently cut the cord. I was quietly uninvited from Thanksgiving dinners. I was left off the family group chats regarding my grandmother's funeral arrangements until the very last minute. They quietly, methodically erased me from their narrative. So I disappeared. I embraced the ghost they wanted me to be. I rented a tiny, miserable, claustrophobic apartment above a 24-hour greasy spoon diner in the bad part of town. The thin walls shook violently every time the fry cook turned on the massive industrial exhaust fan. The place smelled constantly like stale grease, burnt coffee, and desperation. But the rent was cheap, and it gave me a physical space to set up my servers. For the next 5 grueling years, I worked 100-hour weeks. I took exhausting freelance coding jobs, building boring back-end systems for local dentists and mechanics just to pay the rent and keep the electricity on. I dumped every single spare penny into my company. It was brutal, bone-crushing work. There were nights I slept on the hard, splintered wooden floor because my spine was too shot to climb into my mattress on the floor. During that dark period, I brought on a guy from my college days named Greg. Greg was a brilliant front-end developer, a guy who could make any interface look beautiful, but he had absolutely zero patience or loyalty. He wanted quick, easy cash. He wanted to sell our half-finished, unpatented software to the first venture capital buyer who offered us pennies on the dollar. I wanted to build an empire. I wanted to secure airtight patents. When I flatly refused to sell out early, Greg exploded. He packed up his monitors, called me a delusional, arrogant loser, and walked out the door. He promised me I would die broke and alone in that diner apartment. Meanwhile, as I was eating ramen noodles and writing code at 3 a.m., I had to watch Tristan's incredibly fake life unfold on social media. My mother posted endless, curated photos of Tristan and Vanessa on chartered yachts, smiling at charity galas, and standing smugly in front of private jets they didn't own. Tristan was perfectly playing the role of the visionary CEO, fueled entirely by Arthur's money, connections, and aggressive lawyers. They were building a massive legacy made entirely of wet paper. I was building one made of reinforced steel. By my late 20s, I finally finalized my core patent. I had successfully developed an adaptive AI system that could flawlessly regulate energy, security, and climate control for massive commercial buildings, cutting a corporation's overhead utility costs by an astonishing 30%. I didn't waste time chasing local clout or begging for my father's approval. I took my tech straight to Europe. I secured my first major multimillion-dollar contract in Zurich. Then Berlin. Then Geneva. The money started flowing in. Not just a comfortable salary, but real, staggering, generational wealth. I hired a brilliant, ruthless lead engineer named Elena, built a highly secure corporate headquarters downtown, and kept my name entirely out of the press. I operated strictly under a holding company. I wanted my work, my product, to speak for itself, unattached to the poisoned Hayes name. Then, the heavy cardstock invitation arrived in the mail. The Hayes family legacy retreat. My mother had included a passive-aggressive handwritten note on the back, stating she hoped I could afford to take a few days off from my little computer hobbies to celebrate my brother's achievements. I knew exactly what this retreat was. It was a corporate coronation. Arthur was getting ready to step down and officially, legally hand the entire kingdom, the inheritance, the real estate portfolio over to Tristan. I looked at the invitation. I looked at the massive legal team working diligently outside my soundproof glass office. I decided it was finally time to go home and attend the coronation. The private dining room at the resort that evening was nothing short of spectacular. Massive crystal chandeliers hung low over a sprawling, polished mahogany table. Waiters in crisp white gloves silently poured vintage French wine. Sitting at the table were the core family members. My parents, Tristan, and Vanessa. But there were also two very important guests present to witness the weekend's events. One was my Aunt Clara, Arthur's younger sister. Clara was a sharp, fiercely independent woman and the only person in the entire family who saw completely through Tristan's glossy nonsense. Whenever I was around, she always gave me a warm, knowing smile that told me she understood my silence. The other guest was Mr. Sterling, the senior board member and majority stakeholder of Hayes Consulting. He was an old-school, ruthless, incredibly wealthy businessman who held incredible sway over the company's financial future. Towards the end of the main course, Arthur tapped his silver knife against his crystal wine glass to command the room's attention. He stood up, chest puffed out, radiating arrogant pride. He gave a long, winding, self-indulgent speech about the future of commercial real estate, the changing tides of the global market, and the importance of strong bloodlines. Then he raised his glass high toward Tristan. Arthur proudly, loudly announced that Tristan had just single-handedly secured the biggest consulting contract in the 30-year history of the company. A 5-year comprehensive systems overhaul for the massive Apex Corporation. My father called Tristan a true visionary. He said the family legacy, the entire inheritance, was secure in his highly capable hands. Everyone at the table clapped enthusiastically. Vanessa beamed, resting her manicured hand on Tristan's arm, playing the perfect, adoring corporate wife. Tristan soaked the applause in like a sponge, his ego expanding to fill the room. Then, because Tristan could never just win gracefully because he always had to make absolutely sure I was losing, he set his sights on me. Tristan leaned forward, lazily swirling his expensive wine. He looked down the length of the table at me and, with a smirk, asked how my little light bulb fixing business was doing. He loudly told the table that I was a classic tinkerer, a guy always playing with wires in the dark, never quite grasping the big picture of real business. He offered, in a tone dripping with fake, sickening pity, to maybe throw me a tiny subcontractor gig on the Apex deal if I needed to pay off some credit cards or catch up on my rent. I slowly set my fork down. The silver clinked sharply against the fine bone china. I looked at Tristan, letting his words hang in the air, then shifted my gaze over to Mr. Sterling, who was watching the exchange with narrowed, calculating eyes. I calmly, clearly stated that taking a 5-year contract with Apex Corporation was absolute financial suicide. The table went dead silent. The jovial atmosphere evaporated instantly. Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know what the hell I was talking about, accusing me of trying to ruin his son's moment. I kept my voice perfectly even, completely devoid of emotion. I explained to the table that Apex was notorious in the European market for cycling through consulting firms. They would drain a firm's resources for the initial, expensive overhauls and then intentionally break the contract in year 2, tying the consulting firm up in years of litigation with an army of corporate lawyers until the firm went bankrupt. I mentioned very casually that their purchasing director, a Mr. Roth, had actually flown private to my corporate office in Zurich 6 months ago, practically begging to license my automated infrastructure software. "And what did you do, Julian?" Aunt Clara asked, her eyes twinkling with suppressed amusement. "I turned him down flat," I replied, staring directly at my father. "Because my financial analysts ran a background check and discovered their credit rating was completely fabricated. They are insolvent." Tristan exploded. He slammed both hands on the table, making the silverware violently rattle. He called me a pathetic, jealous liar. He screamed that there was absolutely no way a massive international director like Mr. Roth would ever step foot in whatever greasy basement I was operating out of. His face was purple with rage. He accused me of being insanely jealous of his promotion. He yelled that I was probably drowning in shady, illegal debt, taking loans from dangerous people just to rent that Porsche and fake my way through the weekend. He pointed a shaking finger right at my chest, his voice echoing in the large room. "You are a fraud, Julian. You can't possibly afford this lifestyle. Your entire existence is a pathetic lie designed to make you feel better about being a failure." I did not yell back. I did not defend myself with words. I simply reached into the inside breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope bearing the imposing wax seal of one of the largest, most ruthless Swiss investment banks in the world. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table and slid it smoothly down the length of the wood, directly toward my father. "You don't have to take my word for it," I said quietly. "You're welcome to open it, Arthur." Arthur frowned, his anger momentarily replaced by deep confusion. He picked up the envelope, broke the thick wax seal, and pulled out the crisp, watermarked legal documents inside. I watched his eyes scan the text. I watched his pupils dilate in absolute shock. I watched the arrogant, unyielding posture completely collapse out of his spine as the reality of the numbers hit his brain. It was a formal, legally binding letter of intent for a total corporate buyout of my holding company. The offer from the Geneva Fund was $48 million. Cash. Arthur's voice actually shook, cracking like a dry branch, when he read the number out loud to the silent room. $48 million. Tristan froze as if he had been struck by lightning. The smug, condescending color drained entirely from Vanessa's face, leaving her looking physically ill. Mr. Sterling leaned far forward in his chair, his posture totally changing, his eyes suddenly incredibly sharp and intensely interested in me. Aunt Clara just took a slow, highly satisfied sip of her wine, hiding a brilliant predatory smirk behind her crystal glass. I looked directly into Tristan's panicked eyes. I didn't gloat. I just delivered the final blow. "I'm not going to take the offer, obviously," I said casually, adjusting my cuffs. "My analysts project my company will double that valuation by the next fiscal quarter once our Singapore division opens. But Tristan, seriously, make sure your lawyers read the fine print on that Apex contract before it completely bankrupts Arthur's company and ruins your inheritance." I politely excused myself from the table, stood up, and walked out of the dining room, leaving them suffocating in the heavy, crushing, undeniable reality of my success. The next afternoon was the absolute centerpiece of the entire weekend. The heavily anticipated Hayes Family Vision presentation. It was held in the resort's summit room, a gorgeous, state-of-the-art conference space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sweeping pine valleys. The board members were all seated, the senior partners had flown in, and my family sat rigidly in the front row. Tristan was up at the podium. He desperately needed to recover from the absolute humiliation I had handed him at dinner, and I knew a man with an ego that fragile, a man so terrified of losing his golden child status, would do something incredibly desperate. I just didn't realize how dirty and pathetic he was willing to play. Tristan clicked through his slick, overly designed slides using empty corporate buzzwords, talking about market dominance, aggressive expansion, and synergy. Then he paused. He took a deep breath and put on his best, most deeply concerned, sorrowful face. He told the crowded room that transparency and honesty were the absolute core values of Hayes Consulting. He said it broke his heart as a brother to do this, but he needed to protect the board from being manipulated by false information and fabricated wealth. He clicked the remote. A massive screenshot appeared on the main projector. It was a website, but it wasn't my current, highly secure corporate domain. It was the horrible, clunky, embarrassing landing page Greg and I had built 7 years ago when we were starving and working out of that greasy diner apartment. It had a terrible, pixelated logo, broken HTML links, and a list of basic IT services that looked like a neighborhood teenager's handyman flyer. Tristan sighed heavily into the microphone, acting like a martyr. He told the room that this pathetic website was the reality of my so-called tech empire. He told the board that I was clearly suffering from severe delusions of grandeur, perhaps a mental breakdown, and that the Swiss bank document at dinner must have been a highly illegal forgery I bought online. He painted me as a mentally unstable fraud who needed urgent psychiatric help, not a seat at the adult table. In the front row, Vanessa actually pulled a tissue from her designer purse and dabbed at her dry eyes, playing the role of the deeply heartbroken, concerned sister-in-law to perfection. It was a brutal, highly calculated public assassination of my character. It was designed to completely discredit me before I could ever challenge his authority again. But Tristan made one fatal, arrogant mistake. He relied on Greg, a bitter ex-partner who hadn't spoken to me in 7 years, for his intel. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a fit. I simply stood up from my chair in the back row. The room tensed. Mr. Sterling turned his chair entirely around to watch me, his eyes calculating. I walked straight down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the quiet room, right up to the podium. Tristan tried to block me with his body, his face flushed, but I didn't even look at him. I reached out, pulled the HDMI cable out of his laptop, and plugged it directly into my own encrypted tablet. I looked at the senior partners. My brother is absolutely right about one thing, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. Transparency is paramount. I tapped my screen. The projector flashed brilliantly. Up came my actual live corporate dashboard. Real-time metrics from servers across 3 continents. I pulled up the certified, heavily stamped audit reports from the International Bank. I pulled up the active, multimillion-dollar licensing agreements with 3 of the largest commercial real estate developers in Europe. And finally, I displayed the official government-issued patent registry for the AI infrastructure software, with my name and my holding company stamped across the top. I turned to face the completely stunned audience. I explained that the website Tristan just showed them was a defunct domain from 7 years ago, sold to him by a bitter ex-partner for a few $1,000s. I looked at Tristan, who was now sweating profusely through his custom-tailored shirt, his hands shaking. Real businessmen, I said, my voice cold as ice, do not need to dig through the trash to prove their worth, and they certainly don't lie to their board of directors. The room was completely quiet. The senior partners were furiously taking notes. Tristan looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Vanessa's fake tears vanished instantly. Arthur sat frozen, staring at the undeniable proof of his monumental misjudgment. I walked back to my seat, calmly packed my tablet into my leather bag, and left the conference room without looking back. Later that evening, back in the quiet sanctuary of my suite, my encrypted phone buzzed. It was Elena, my lead engineer back at headquarters. She had been running a deep, aggressive trace on a series of anonymous, highly defamatory emails that had been sent to my European partners over the last 2 weeks, trying to falsely accuse me of intellectual property theft and tank my reputation. Elena's voice was sharp. She told me she had cracked the routing. The metadata and the IP address were a direct, undeniable match. The sabotage emails didn't come from a corporate competitor. They came directly from Tristan and Vanessa's private home network. Vanessa had been meticulously crafting the lies, and Tristan had been sending them. It was a federal offense. It was actionable corporate sabotage. I thanked Elena, told her to package the evidence for our legal team, and hung up. I stared out the window into the dark, freezing mountain night. The betrayal was so incredibly deep it almost felt cold. My own brother was trying to destroy my livelihood. Then my phone rang again. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered it. It was Liam, Tristan's personal assistant. His voice was shaking violently, whispering into the receiver. He told me he was hiding in the resort's catering kitchen. He said he couldn't keep the secret anymore because he knew Tristan's arrogance was going to destroy the entire company and cost hundreds of people their jobs. Liam told me exactly what Tristan was planning to present at the massive, highly publicized shareholder banquet in 3 months. The grand reveal of Tristan's new, revolutionary product that was supposed to secure his position as CEO. When Liam told me what the product was, the blood completely froze in my veins. Tristan hadn't just tried to ruin my reputation. He hadn't just lied to the board. He had stolen from me. He had stolen my original blueprints. And he was about to present my own patented technology to the world as his own invention. I told Liam to secure all internal files, keep his head down, and wait for my signal. I ended the call. The storm wasn't over. It was just gathering its true strength, and I was going to be the one to bring the lightning. For 3 long, agonizingly slow months following the mountain retreat, I did absolutely nothing. I did not call my father to demand an apology. I did not retaliate publicly against Tristan's pathetic, desperate smear campaign. I simply sat in my highly secure downtown corporate office, surrounded by my brilliant engineering team, and I watched the clock tick down. Patience is the ultimate, undeniable weapon of the self-made man. People who inherit their power, people exactly like my older brother, have absolutely no concept of patience because they have never actually had to wait for anything in their entire privileged lives. They want the massive executive promotion immediately. They want the staggering 6-figure salary bump without ever putting in the grueling hours. They want to secure the multi-million-dollar family inheritance before the funeral even happens. I knew with absolute certainty that Tristan's blind arrogance would be his own executioner. I just needed to be disciplined enough to hand him the rope and watch him tie the knot. During this period of intense waiting, Liam, Tristan's incredibly anxious but morally conflicted personal assistant, became my absolute lifeline. Every single Friday evening, precisely at 6 o'clock, Liam would call me from an untraceable burner phone while sitting in a crowded, noisy coffee shop 3 towns over from the Hayes Consulting corporate headquarters. He fed me the exact, terrifying details of Tristan's grand scheme. Tristan was taking the old, unrefined, highly flawed blueprints I had naively shown my father a decade ago in his study, wrapping them in a shiny new corporate presentation, and brazenly branding the stolen technology as Hayes Sync. It was supposed to be a revolutionary, proprietary automated infrastructure system that would theoretically guarantee Hayes Consulting a total, unshakable monopoly over the entire European commercial real estate market. Tristan had recklessly hired a massive team of external, highly paid graphic designers and marketing consultants to create stunning, hyper-realistic 3D renderings of the system. He was bleeding millions of our father's investment capital on a massive advertising campaign for a product he fundamentally did not understand, could not code, and could not actually build. It was the ultimate corporate illusion, a house of cards built on a foundation of pure theft. And Arthur, completely blinded by his desperate, consuming need for a perfect golden heir, was blindly rubber-stamping every single fraudulent expense report Tristan slid across his desk. The grand stage for this monumental fraud was officially set at the annual Hayes Consulting shareholder banquet. This was not just a simple corporate dinner. It was the single most important night of the fiscal year. It was the critical night where massive financial decisions were made, where ruthless board members heavily scrutinized the company's trajectory, and where tens of millions of dollars in investment capital hung delicately in the balance. It was being held at the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, a venue so incredibly exclusive and expensive it took 2 full years just to get on their waiting list. I obviously did not receive a formal invitation. I did not need one. I owned the company that handled the plaza's entire back-end security protocol. When the highly anticipated night of the banquet finally arrived, the city was freezing, hammered by a bitter, relentless winter storm that coated the streets in black ice. I wore a tailored midnight charcoal suit, sharp, incredibly expensive, but completely understated. I did not want to look like a man seeking attention. I wanted to look like an executioner. I carried a heavy, reinforced steel briefcase. Inside that incredibly secure briefcase was the physical, fully functional prototype of the exact technology Tristan was about to claim as his own, along with a thick stack of legally binding, government-stamped patent documents proving my absolute ownership. I walked into the lavish plaza lobby, blending perfectly with the massive sea of wealthy investors, anxious stakeholders, and sharp corporate lawyers. The grand ballroom was a staggering spectacle of excessive, unearned wealth. Massive, glittering crystal chandeliers bathed the enormous room in a warm, golden, flattering glow. Waiters in immaculate white tuxedos glided silently between the tables, carrying heavy silver trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar. I stood quietly near the back of the room, partially obscured by a massive, towering floral arrangement, and simply watched my family operate in their natural habitat. My mother, Eleanor, was wearing an absolutely stunning, custom-designed gown, practically holding court near the front row of VIP tables. She looked incredibly proud, beaming with a sickeningly sweet smile, accepting premature congratulations from other wealthy corporate wives, as if she had personally engineered the revolutionary technology herself. Arthur was aggressively working the room like a seasoned, desperate politician, shaking hands firmly, patting powerful board members on the back, and directing everyone's attention toward the massive, brightly lit stage at the front of the room. He was glowing with validation. This was his lifelong dream realized. His chosen son, the golden child he had groomed for decades, was about to cement the family legacy forever. Then the main lights dimmed. A sudden, expectant hush fell over the massive crowd of 300 people. Epic, cinematic, incredibly dramatic music began to play over the state-of-the-art sound system. A brilliant, blinding white spotlight hit the exact center of the stage. Tristan walked out. He was dressed flawlessly in a custom tuxedo, exuding a practiced, completely manufactured confidence that hid the absolute void of talent underneath. He held a sleek, wireless presentation clicker in his right hand. Vanessa sat perfectly postured in the front row, clapping louder and harder than anyone else in the building, a look of fierce, unadulterated, greedy triumph plastered on her heavily made-up face. She was already mentally spending the money. Tristan took a deep, theatrical breath, looking out over the vast sea of wealthy investors. He began his presentation. He spoke beautifully. I will always give him that one singular credit. He knew exactly how to perform for an audience. He talked passionately about the rapidly evolving landscape of global real estate, the urgent, pressing need for sustainable commercial infrastructure, and the heavy responsibility of Hayes Consulting to boldly lead the industry into the 21st century. For 30 incredible years, my father built this magnificent company on unwavering trust, strong relationships, and incredibly solid foundations, Tristan projected to the crowd, his voice echoing perfectly through the silent room. But the foundation of tomorrow requires bold innovation. It requires a system that actively thinks, rapidly adapts, and fiercely protects our massive investments. Tonight, I am incredibly proud and deeply humbled to finally unveil a highly classified project I have been personally developing in absolute secrecy for the last 4 years. A project that will completely redefine our entire industry. He raised his hand dramatically and clicked the wireless remote. The massive, high-definition screen behind him ignited with brilliant color. A flawless, incredibly detailed 3D rendering of a central processing hub appeared, rotating slowly to show every angle. Massive, bold, glowing letters flashed across the massive screen. Hayes Sync. The crowd let out a collective, highly impressed gasp of admiration. Arthur nodded solemnly in the front row. His chest puffed out so far the buttons on his tuxedo looked strained. Mr. Sterling, sitting quietly at the center head table, leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the stunning visual spectacle. Tristan confidently began to break down the highly complex technical specifications. He smoothly described the adaptive climate control protocols, the automated, unbreakable security grids, and the revolutionary energy efficiency algorithms. I stood in the back of the room, my blood running ice cold. He was literally reading the exact, specific bullet points from the blueprint I had poured my blood, sweat, and endless tears into a decade ago in that miserable, roach-infested diner apartment. He was brazenly stealing my entire life's work, my countless sleepless nights, and the undeniable genius of my engineering team, and he was serving it up to the world as his own brilliant vision. He confidently promised the eager board of directors that the physical prototype was already in the final stages of manufacturing, and that they would begin exclusive, highly lucrative installations within the next 2 financial quarters. The applause that followed was absolutely thunderous. It was an immediate standing ovation. Powerful people were eagerly getting to their feet, clapping wildly for a man who could not even write a basic line of HTML code if his life depended on it. I watched Vanessa stand up eagerly, cheering wildly for the husband who was about to secure her a massive, multi-generational inheritance. I watched my mother delicately wipe a tear of absolute, overflowing joy from her eye. I watched my father look up at his eldest son with the pure, unadulterated, unconditional pride he had actively and cruelly denied me my entire life. I gripped the cold steel handle of my heavy briefcase. The metal felt incredibly grounding against my sweating palm. I waited patiently for the applause to reach its absolute, deafening peak. I waited until Tristan was completely, entirely bathed in the glorious light of his stolen achievement. I waited until he felt completely, utterly untouchable. Then, I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement and started walking down the center aisle. The grand, cavernous ballroom was still actively echoing with enthusiastic, ringing applause when I stepped confidently out from the deep shadows at the back of the room and began my slow, incredibly deliberate walk down the long, heavily carpeted center aisle. I did not rush my steps. I did not run like a madman. I walked with the heavy, undeniable, terrifying weight of a man who possessed the absolute, destructive truth. The wealthy investors seated at the back tables noticed my presence first. The loud clapping nearest to me began to falter awkwardly, then stop entirely as people turned their heads in deep confusion. The sudden, eerie silence spread like a highly contagious virus, moving steadily from the back of the massive room all the way to the front rows. By the time I reached the exact halfway point of the long aisle, the thunderous, joyful standing ovation had completely died, replaced by an incredibly tense, heavy, suffocating silence that felt exactly like a funeral. Tristan was standing proudly at the wooden podium, a massive, victorious, deeply arrogant smile plastered across his face. But as the entire room fell completely quiet, he finally looked past the adoring front row. He scanned the aisle. He saw me. His massive smile did not just fade. It violently, spectacularly shattered. The practiced, arrogant, perfectly postured CEO persona completely collapsed in real time. He gripped the sharp edges of the wooden podium so incredibly hard his knuckles turned stark, bone white. He looked exactly like a terrified man who had just seen a vengeful ghost walk out of a freshly dug grave. I finally reached the very front of the room. The silence was absolutely, terrifyingly suffocating. 300 pairs of highly influential eyes were locked directly on me, waiting for the impending disaster. I looked directly at Arthur, who had half risen from his expensive seat, his aging face twisting rapidly into a horrible mask of sudden panic and furious outrage. I looked at Vanessa, whose clapping hands had dropped limply to her sides, her jaw hanging entirely slack in disbelief. I looked at Mr. Sterling, the ruthless senior board member, whose sharp, calculating eyes darted suspiciously from Tristan's visibly terrified face to the heavy steel briefcase gripped tightly in my right hand. I did not ask for a microphone. I simply projected my voice, making it sharp, deep, and clear as broken glass, sending it ringing across the completely silent ballroom. "Excuse me," I announced, my voice easily cutting through the heavy, tense air. I sincerely apologize for the sudden interruption to this lovely evening, but there has been a monumental, highly illegal mistake in tonight's presentation. Arthur finally found his voice, breaking through his shock. He stepped aggressively forward. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson with absolute rage, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my chest. "Julian, how absolutely dare you? Security, get this man out of here immediately. You are ruining your brother's most important night. You are trying to ruin this entire company out of sheer, pathetic jealousy." Two massive, heavily built hotel security guards immediately began moving rapidly down the side aisles toward me. But Mr. Sterling suddenly raised a single, highly authoritative hand from the head table. The guards froze instantly in their tracks. Mr. Sterling was the money. Mr. Sterling possessed the real, undeniable power in this room, not my father. "Let the young man speak, Arthur," Mr. Sterling commanded, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "If he has a legitimate concern regarding the proprietary technology we are about to invest tens of millions of dollars into, I absolutely want to hear it before I sign a single check." Arthur swallowed incredibly hard, looking physically ill and suddenly very weak. He sank slowly back into his chair, glaring daggers at me. I stepped calmly up the short, carpeted staircase onto the massive stage. Tristan physically backed away from me in sheer terror, retreating step by step until his back hit the giant projection screen displaying the stolen design. He looked incredibly small. I walked directly to the center of the brightly lit stage. I set the heavy steel briefcase down firmly on the polished wooden floor. I snapped the reinforced metal locks open. The sharp, mechanical sound echoed loudly in the painfully quiet room. I slowly opened the heavy lid. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek, incredibly heavy, fully functional, beautifully engineered physical processing hub. It was the exact, undeniable physical manifestation of the 3D rendering currently glowing brightly on the massive screen directly behind us. The only distinct difference was the heavy, deeply engraved metal authentication plate bolted securely to the front of my device. I held the heavy piece of hardware high in the air for the entire room to clearly see. "This," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority, "is the adaptive infrastructure hub my brother just spent 20 minutes passionately describing to you. It is entirely flawless. It is completely revolutionary. And it is completely, legally, and undeniably mine." The collective gasp from the massive audience was intensely audible. Furious whispers erupted across the room like a sudden wildfire. Tristan began to stammer loudly, a pathetic, desperate, whining sound. He's lying. That's a fake. It's a cheap prop. He bought it online to humiliate me. Arthur, tell them he's clinically crazy. Get him out of here." I ignored his pathetic whining entirely. I reached back into the secure briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of heavily bound, notarized legal documents. I walked directly over to the very edge of the stage, standing right above Mr. Sterling's VIP table. I looked the senior board member directly and fearlessly in the eye. "Mr. Sterling, you are a highly experienced man who deeply understands the absolutely devastating financial consequences of a massive corporate lawsuit. What I hold in my hand right now is United States Patent Number 847B, fully filed, vetted, and secured by my private holding company over 3 entire years ago. Alongside it are the massive international patents legally secured in Zurich, Berlin, and Geneva." I handed the thick, heavy stack of verified documents down to Mr. Sterling. He took them eagerly, immediately whipping out his expensive reading glasses and turning on the small table lamp to inspect them. I turned back to face the massive crowd, pointing an accusatory finger directly at the massive screen behind the trembling Tristan. "The beautiful design you see glowing on that screen is a direct, unauthorized, highly illegal replica of my deeply proprietary technology. My brother did not invent this system. He stole the early schematic drawings I personally presented to my father a decade ago. He paid external designers millions of your dollars to render my private work, and he stands before you tonight attempting to commit massive, undeniable corporate fraud by securing your massive investment capital for a product he legally cannot manufacture, sell, distribute, or even touch. The frantic whispers in the room instantly turned into a chaotic, angry uproar. Wealthy investors were rapidly pulling out their phones, furiously texting their legal teams and stockbrokers. Board members were shouting angrily at each other across the tables. Arthur looked like he was having a massive heart attack. He stumbled blindly forward, desperately grabbing the edge of the stage for physical support. "Julian, this is absolute madness. We are your family. You cannot possibly do this to your own brother. You are destroying his promotion. You are destroying the massive college fund for his future children. Think about your poor mother. Think about the Hayes legacy." I looked down at my sweating, desperate father, the man who had actively humiliated me, completely discarded me, and tried to aggressively force me into a life of quiet servitude. "You completely lost the right to use the word family 10 agonizing years ago, Arthur," I replied coldly, showing absolutely zero mercy. "You wanted a grand legacy. Well, take a good look around. This is it. This is the legacy you built. A pathetic golden child who has to actively steal to survive, and a father entirely too blind to see the rot in his own house." Mr. Sterling suddenly slammed his heavy, meaty hand violently down on his wooden table. The incredibly loud crack instantly silenced the chaotic room once again. He stood up slowly to his full height, tightly holding my patent documents in his hand. His face was a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated corporate fury. He looked directly at Tristan, who was now trembling visibly, practically crying against the massive screen. The patent numbers on these legal documents matched the serial codes engraved on the physical prototype perfectly, Mr. Sterling announced, his deep voice echoing with absolute, terrifying finality. He slowly turned his furious, terrifying gaze to Arthur. "Arthur, your golden son has just aggressively exposed this entire firm to a multimillion-dollar intellectual property lawsuit that will bankrupt us all. He blatantly lied to the board. He lied to the shareholders." Tristan desperately tried to speak, hot tears of pure panic welling in his wide eyes. "Mr. Sterling, sir, please, I can explain everything. It was just a simple misunderstanding of the licensing protocols." "Shut your damn mouth, boy," Mr. Sterling roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers, shutting Tristan down instantly. The senior board member turned his attention to the rest of the shocked room. "This fraudulent presentation is over. The board of directors will immediately convene an emergency session in the penthouse suite." The grand, perfect illusion was completely, permanently shattered. The great, untouchable Hayes legacy had just burned entirely to the ground in front of 300 highly influential witnesses. I calmly picked up my physical prototype, securely locked my steel briefcase, and walked off the stage. I had completely won. The immediate, chaotic aftermath of the ruined banquet was a scene of absolute, spectacular corporate carnage. The grand ballroom emptied in record time as wealthy, terrified investors fled the room like rats from a sinking ship, absolutely terrified of being legally associated with a massive, highly public intellectual property scandal. The only people left in the massive, echoing space were the confused hotel cleanup crew and my shattered family, who were currently huddled together in the private VIP holding room located directly behind the main stage. I did not immediately leave the building. I walked calmly into that holding room, setting my heavy steel briefcase loudly on the expensive glass coffee table. Tristan was sitting completely collapsed on a plush velvet sofa, his head buried deep in his hands, completely hyperventilating, struggling to pull air into his lungs. Vanessa was pacing the carpeted floor like a caged, terrified animal, her face totally pale, frantically dialing her personal lawyer on her cell phone. The absolute reality of losing her incredible, luxurious lifestyle, her guaranteed massive inheritance, and her elite social status was hitting her system like a speeding freight train. Eleanor was weeping loudly and openly, desperately dabbing her ruined makeup with a soaked silk handkerchief. Arthur stood silently by the large window, staring blankly out at the freezing, unforgiving city. He looked at least 20 years older than he had an hour ago. The arrogant, untouchable titan of industry was completely gone, rapidly replaced by a broken, terrified, pathetic old man currently facing the absolute destruction of his life's work. Eleanor saw me enter and immediately rushed toward me, aggressively grabbing the lapels of my expensive coat. Her hot, messy tears actively stained my expensive wool. "Julian, please, I am begging you," she pleaded, her voice cracking horribly, completely discarding her carefully cultivated upper-crust persona. "Please, you have to withdraw those patent documents. You have to go upstairs and tell Mr. Sterling it was just a huge mistake, a joint family venture gone wrong. If you file this massive lawsuit, Tristan will go to a federal prison. He'll lose absolutely everything. You are brothers. You share the exact same blood. You cannot destroy him." I gently, but incredibly firmly, removed her shaking hands from my coat. I stepped back deliberately, creating a massive physical boundary between us. Sharing blood does not magically give you a free, unlimited pass to commit federal fraud, Mother, I stated calmly, my voice totally level. And it certainly doesn't excuse a full decade of relentless psychological abuse. Tristan made his own choice the very moment he decided to steal my life's work to feed his pathetic, insatiable ego. Vanessa aggressively stopped pacing and turned violently on me, her eyes flashing with desperate, toxic venom. "You planned this entire thing. You waited until the absolute biggest night of his entire life to completely ruin him in public. You're an absolute monster, Julian." I let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and pulled out a single, heavily encrypted black flash drive. I tossed it carelessly onto the glass table. It landed with a sharp, echoing clack. "You really want to talk about monsters, Vanessa?" I asked, staring her down until she physically shrank back. "That drive contains the complete, legally verified metadata trace of the anonymous, highly defamatory sabotage emails you sent to my European partners 3 months ago. The exact emails attempting to completely ruin my reputation and aggressively destroy my business. The IP address traces directly, undeniably back to your private home network. I have the exact timestamps. I have the drafted text files Elena pulled directly from your unsecured server." Vanessa physically recoiled as if she had been slapped, instantly covering her mouth with her shaking hand. Tristan looked up from the sofa, his eyes widening in fresh, absolute terror at this new revelation. "That is a massive federal cybercrime," I continued, my voice entirely devoid of any human mercy. "It is blatant corporate espionage. If I hand that drive over to the authorities tomorrow morning, both of you will be facing severe, lengthy jail time, and any judge in this country will rapidly grant a massive civil judgment that will aggressively seize every single asset you currently own." Arthur finally turned heavily away from the window. He walked slowly, painfully toward the center of the room. He looked down at the small flash drive, then looked directly at Tristan with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust I had never seen on a father's face before. "Arthur," I said, addressing my broken father directly, "you have exactly 1 hour before Mr. Sterling convenes that emergency board meeting upstairs. You know exactly what you have to do to save yourself." Arthur closed his eyes tightly. He took a deep, shuddering, painful breath. When he opened them, the brutal decision was made. He was a ruthless businessman first, and a father second. To save the dying company, he had to aggressively amputate the highly infected limb. "Tristan," Arthur said, his voice completely dead and hollow, "you are officially, permanently suspended from Hayes Consulting, effective immediately. You will surrender your company keys, your corporate credit accounts, and your access badges to building security tonight before you leave. Tomorrow morning, you will sign a formal resignation letter citing severe, sudden health issues." Tristan let out a pathetic, guttural wail, physically falling off the sofa onto his knees. "Dad, no, please. I'm your son. I'm the chosen heir. I was doing it for the family. You are a massive legal liability, Arthur roared, the last terrifying remnants of his old strength flaring up. You stole. You lied to the board. You nearly cost me my entire company and my entire fortune. Arthur turned slowly back to me. His eyes were wide and desperately pleading. He practically crawled toward me, his hands reaching out. Julian, son, you have completely proven yourself to me. You are absolutely brilliant. You built a massive empire from absolutely nothing. Let's merge the companies. Bring your incredible technology into Hayes Consulting. We will rebrand everything. You will be the sole, undisputed CEO. The entire legacy will be yours to control. Just please, I am begging you, drop the lawsuit. It was the exact, specific offer I had desperately dreamed of hearing when I was 22 years old. It was the ultimate, final validation. The kingdom was finally mine for the taking. I looked at my desperate father. I searched my soul, and I felt absolutely nothing. No lingering anger, no triumphant joy, just an overwhelming sense of profound, quiet peace. No, Arthur, I said quietly, firmly. Arthur looked completely stunned, as if I had shot him. What? Why? It's everything you ever wanted from me. I picked up my steel briefcase. I looked deeply at my weeping mother, my utterly ruined brother on his knees, and my broken, pathetic father. Because 10 years ago, your grand legacy had absolutely no room for me, I said, my voice perfectly steady and confident. And looking closely at what your legacy has actually become, I have absolutely no room for it in my life. Have your lawyers contact my legal team regarding a massive financial settlement for the IP theft. Do not ever attempt to call me again. I turned my back on my toxic family forever. I walked out of the VIP holding room, strode through the completely empty, incredibly silent grand ballroom, and walked out into the freezing winter night. I calmly handed my ticket to the valet, got comfortably into my warm Porsche, and drove far away from the smoking wreckage of their lives without checking the rearview mirror a single time. One full, incredibly peaceful year has passed since the explosive night the Hayes legacy completely imploded in that grand ballroom. When you finally find the immense courage to cut the highly toxic, cancerous tissue entirely out of your life, the speed at which you begin to heal is truly miraculous. The universe has an incredibly satisfying, almost poetic way of balancing the scales of justice, and the absolute, undeniable reality of their miserable new lives is something they are forced to wake up and face every single morning. Tristan did not go to federal prison. After intense negotiation, I agreed to a quiet, incredibly expensive corporate settlement with the Board of Hayes Consulting to keep the criminal matter out of the public courts, mostly to generously spare Aunt Clara the massive public embarrassment. However, the severe internal consequences were absolutely devastating for my brother. The furious board of directors aggressively stripped Tristan of all his accumulated equity and shares. He was permanently, legally banned from ever holding an executive position within the industry again. Today, the former golden child works incredibly long hours in a tiny, windowless, poorly ventilated office in the damp basement of a minor logistics firm owned by an old, pitying friend of Arthur's. He answers angry phone calls and files basic shipping reports all day. His new salary is a tiny, pathetic fraction of his former lavish lifestyle, barely enough to cover his basic living expenses. Vanessa, entirely predictably, did not stick around for the depressing poverty tour. The exact moment the corporate credit cards were frozen, the massive salary was slashed, and the luxury cars were aggressively repossessed by the bank, she immediately filed for divorce. It was a brutal, incredibly ugly, highly publicized legal battle. Because Tristan had foolishly signed a poorly drafted, legally weak prenuptial agreement years ago, Vanessa's highly aggressive divorce lawyer managed to secure nearly half of his remaining personal assets in the final settlement. There were no children involved in the marriage, thank God, so there was no messy, traumatizing custody battle over kids, but she essentially left him entirely financially ruined and completely alone in a cheap apartment. As for the infamous, highly touted Apex Corporation contract that Tristan had so proudly championed at that disastrous dinner, exactly as my analysts and I had predicted, Apex aggressively broke the contract early in the second year, outright refusing to pay out the final tens of millions of dollars. They falsely cited incomplete deliverables and poor management. Mr. Roth, the arrogant purchasing director who had previously begged for my superior technology, was unceremoniously fired amidst a massive internal auditing scandal. Hayes Consulting took a massive, catastrophic financial hit from the fallout, forcing Arthur into an early, highly stressful, and deeply disgraced retirement. His once proud real estate empire is now a fraction of its former glory. My life, on the other hand, rapidly expanded into territories I never even dreamed were possible when I was sleeping on that hard diner floor. My holding company officially, highly successfully launched the AI infrastructure technology across all of Europe and rapidly expanded into the highly lucrative Asian markets. We recently opened a massive, state-of-the-art new headquarters in downtown Tokyo. The immense wealth I have generated is completely secure, totally independent, and heavily guarded by my own dedicated legal team. But vastly more importantly than the money in the bank, I finally found absolute, profound peace of mind. Late one night, about 6 months ago, my private, unlisted phone rang. It was Arthur. I debated simply ignoring it, but curiosity won, and I answered. The line was quiet for a very long time. I could clearly hear his heavy, tired, labored breathing through the speaker. I saw the massive article in the Wall Street Journal, Arthur finally said, his voice incredibly raspy and frail, sounding completely defeated, about the massive Singapore expansion. Yes, I replied simply, offering absolutely nothing else to the conversation. You built something truly incredible, Julian, he whispered. It sounded like forcing the words out physically hurt his throat. You did well. You did very, very well. He didn't explicitly apologize for the abuse. He didn't ask for my forgiveness. He just offered the absolute final validation I had spent my entire youth desperately starving for. I waited quietly for the old, familiar feelings to rush in. The desperate, pathetic need for his fatherly approval. The intense desire to scream at him for all the lost, painful years. But absolutely nothing came. The emotional well was completely, entirely dry. Thank you, Arthur, I said calmly, feeling absolutely nothing but closure. Goodbye. I hung up the phone and permanently blocked the number from my device. I realized with absolute clarity in that exact moment that his validation meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I didn't need him to tell me I was successful. I had the massive patents, the thriving company, and the deep self-respect to continually prove it to myself every single day. Last week, Aunt Clara came to visit my stunning new penthouse office. She brought a beautiful bottle of incredible vintage wine and a small, elegantly framed photograph. It was a picture of me, taken when I was exactly 10 years old, covered in engine grease, holding a broken toaster I had successfully taken apart and put back together. It was the only surviving picture from my entire childhood where I was actually smiling a genuine, truly happy smile. Clara poured us both a generous glass of wine. She looked around my beautiful, expansive office, then looked deeply at me with immense, genuine pride. You know, Julian, she said softly, holding her glass, the absolute hardest lesson anyone can ever learn in this life is that sometimes, the family you are accidentally born into is just a biological accident. True family, the people who actually, truly matter, are the ones who respect your boundaries, celebrate your unique mind, and love you fiercely when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but yourself. She was entirely, undeniably right. I had spent so incredibly long trying desperately to fit into a rigid mold that was actively crushing my spirit. I falsely thought that enduring the constant disrespect was just the mandatory price of admission for their conditional love. It wasn't until I bravely walked away, until I set an ironclad boundary and fiercely protected my own energy, that I truly discovered my actual, meaningful purpose. My purpose wasn't to be a secondary, forgotten character in Tristan's fake, glamorous life. It was to be the master architect of my own incredible reality. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. To anyone out there watching this video right now, especially if you have spent agonizing decades pouring your heart and soul into a toxic family that only views you as a minor inconvenience or a convenient tool to be used, please hear my words carefully. You absolutely do not owe your precious sanity to people who repeatedly disrespect your clear boundaries. You do not owe blind loyalty to people who fiercely protect your abusers. Walking away is never a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate, powerful declaration of your own immense, undeniable value. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own family? Have you ever had to bravely walk away from highly toxic relatives to aggressively protect your own future and mental health? Share your personal story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, keep aggressively building your own legacy in absolute silence, and let your massive success make all the noise.